So now for the main event, what you all came here to hear, what I came here to hear, frankly. Steve Strauss is a distinguished professor in the College of Forestry at Oregon State. He is the director of the Outreach in Biotechnology program at the university. He is also a fellow of the Leopold Leadership Program at Stanford University, and he is director of the Tree Biosafety and Genomics Research Cooperative at OSU. Steve has degrees from Cornell, from Yale, from Cal, Berkeley. And by the way, anybody who knows him, you know that Steve's also a soccer referee. So when he leaves the lab, he leaves the controversies of scientific enterprise. He goes onto a high school soccer field and tries to negotiate with the soccer players, and he has cards, and he brought them here tonight to make sure that we're all in line. So if you're asking a question, you're a little bit on the edge, you'll get a yellow card, and if you're way out of line, you're going to get a red card, and you'll be out on your air. But of course, I'm just kidding. But I'm not kidding about his soccer endeavors, and Steve is, I can't imagine being a referee. I watch these people work and I think, how do you do that? But so he is good at negotiating controversy, and he's going to share his knowledge and his perspective on genetic engineering of food and crops with us tonight. So please give Steve Strauss a warm Science Pub welcome.
How's that, Justin? Wow. Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm overwhelmed. I see there's a lot of friends here. I'm sure there'll be some enemies before the night is through. But it's really an exciting opportunity to come talk to you about this amazingly exciting and controversial area of science and technology. So when I talk to people who are pretty savvy, but they're not nerds like me. They don't know about genetics. And they sometimes will say, what's all this controversy about GMOs? Aren't foods already genetically engineered? That's what I've heard. And so what I tell them is, yeah, they are, functionally. And so you may or may not know that things like maize, corn, that's what it looks like in the wild as teosinte. Several major mutations are what brought about maize, but this was done by non-scientific methods by native people in Mexico thousands of years ago. The tomato, wild progenitor, highly toxic in contrast to what we have today that's either large, sweet, and luscious or large and tastes like cardboard, one or the other. Lettuce, similar story, wild lettuce versus domesticated lettuce. Rice, a single gene that's dwarfed it, that's the basis of the green revolution in rice and wheat, that allows farmers to put a lot of inputs in, a lot of fertilizer, and instead of the plants growing up tall and mostly producing vegetative matter, they produce mostly seeds, and they don't fall over in wind and rainstorms. That was not a GMO, it's not genetic engineering in the current sense, but very much like a genetic engineering phenomenon, similar in outcome but not in method. And you can look at the banana, the wild banana versus the cultivated banana, where an entire set of chromosomes was added to make it sterile. And there's lots of other examples. I'm just going to give you a couple of looks. The brassicas, the mustards, starting from this very inconspicuous little plant called wild cabbage through old methods of genetic engineering, we've produced this incredible diversity, of which I'm just showing you a piece, that are some of the healthiest foods that we eat, of course, and you know all about that. And these are major mutations that have caused these changes in gross morphology, but not using current genetic engineering, as I'll tell you about, using these older methods. And sometimes we can't find the mutants that we want through breeding, or it's very difficult, so we use things like irradiation or chemical mutagenesis. And I've been told that some of the best microbrews are made from barley that's gone through this irradiation. So perhaps it gives you a little extra buzz. I don't know. But I will drink to that, though. And then, of course, this is not just plants. This is also animals, and you could look at all the different kinds of livestock. Chickens are a pretty obvious example. My favorite is dogs. We know that all dogs derive from the wolf. Amazing with the extraordinary diversity of dogs, of which you see a tiny fraction of the different varieties here. So again, it's reasonable that people I talk to would think that we're already doing genetic engineering, but in fact, these are all using the old selective crossbreeding kinds of methods. And this is not something that just happened a long time ago and now it doesn't happen anymore. Breeders make amazing progress every day, aggressively crossing hundreds of different varieties, making new hybrids, new inbreds, cloning them, testing them. Lots of the properties they're changing, the nutrition, the protein content, the allergen content, their adaptation to environment. We don't see, obviously, they're not easy to see. Some of them, like this is the indigo rose. Jim Myers at Oregon State bred this. It has this purple exterior. It's higher in antioxidants. It's considered to possibly be healthy. There's also a GMO version of this that's completely purple, but it's not on the market and probably never will be because of all the issues we'll talk about tonight. So breeding continues. We continue to do genetic engineering, and in the age of DNA sequence, we not only can look at what's called the phenotype, how it looks, how it behaves, but we can look at the DNA that underlies that and really speed things up. So it's a wonderful, exciting time for science, for this old kind of genetic engineering. But if you use this method of transgenics, which I'm going to tell you about briefly what it is, people get really, really, really excited. It brings out thousands of people to protest for a variety of reasons. So we know about this in Oregon. It shocked me that the last couple of weeks we had this special session of the legislature where our governor said, you will pass all these bills or you will pass none of them. And one of them was motivated by the GMO controversy. It was an attempt to preclude individual counties from having their own GMO laws. And I realize this is hard to read, but this is from the bill here. The agricultural seed, flower, nursery, etc. Industries in the state will be adversely affected if those industries are subject to a patchwork of local regulations. So apart from that in Jackson County that beat this bill, this basically makes it impossible. So Benton County was going to have one as well, right here. That might have made it very hard for any of us who do research with GMO crops to do it, actually. It would have been quite exciting. So, but anyway, it just shows how strong some of the sentiment is, and Oregon is one of the epicenters of it. So, as Nick said, the views are really polarized. So this is a survey that was done in about 2000 by Susan Horning-Priest at Texas A&M, and things have only gotten more polarized since. So what you see when you ask broad questions like, do you believe these technologies will, quote, improve our way of life in the next 20 years, will have no effect or will make things worse, what you see is that genetic engineering and nuclear power have these similar sort of bimodal patterns, where deleterious is in yellow, improvement is in brown, black is don't know. You see this, so a lot of people think it'll improve, but a lot of people think it will be deleterious. And this isn't just food and agriculture, this is all genetic engineering. So people have a queasiness about it that looks a lot like the queasiness they have about nuclear power. Actually, I took that slide out because I was told this talk can't be 4 hours long, just this afternoon. So, but she also did other surveys, and when you ask more specifically about GM foods, will it bring benefits, will it cause disasters, you see a similar bimodal kind of pattern. This is a more recent survey. This is something, this polarization is not just in the United States, it's worldwide in all industrial countries. This is a survey that was just released a few weeks ago in Australia, where the social scientists were making the point that things are very polarized, about 50-50 before and against, and it's based on your broad value system. It's not based on your detailed knowledge of genetics and genetic modification in agriculture. So here you see in the against segments, there's one that's really not engaged, but doesn't really like technology, doesn't trust it. And then there's a segment that is engaged and thinks they know a lot, but is very much against it. And this tends to be associated with people who also don't think it's important to vaccinate children. So they have a different information base, but they feel very well informed. And then in the fours, there were two segments: the cautiously keen, liking the technology benefits, but also realizing there are risks. so want to go forward, but always keep the balance right. I'd put myself there. And then there's just the techno-crazy that let's just do tech, man, and get out of the way. So, but the really important point is that these are deep values, and if you ask questions about pesticides or radiation in medicine, you would see a similar partitioning. So these things are quite deep. I'm a tree guy, but I think I only have one tree slide in here if you don't count papaya. One of the awakenings that I had, so a little bit of a diversion to tell my own story, as a scientist in this area, just starting to do genetic modification of trees, just starting to sequence DNA, this field was really coming into its own. Very, very exciting time in the late 90s. And I was the chairman of this organization of forest biotechnologists around the world, and we were having a meeting in Oxford. Amazing place, beautiful. If you've ever been to Oxford, it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous environment. So Sunday night, we're gathering in a conference hall with the beautiful high ceilings and all the scientists hobnobbing with each other, feeling like we're at some great time in the history of our little field. And that very night, there was vandalism going on against the only field trial of genetically engineered trees in the UK. And so the vandals did this to kind of welcome the scientists to the UK. That was very nice of them. And what kind of amazed us, and we found out about this in the morning, was also the press coverage about it, which was incredibly hostile. So you see this thing, Frankenstein's forest. While its public attention has been focused on the threat of Frankenstein foods, the same corporations who are forcing us to ingest GM meals have been quietly perpetrating yet another crime against the environment. So that was the narrative. In reality, what these trees were, these are poplar trees, kinds of aspens, and they had a gene, a natural gene for making lignin, this plasticky stuff that glues wood together, waterproofs, it makes it rot resistant, but also gets in the way when you want to make paper and ethanol, biofuels. So the idea was to weaken the lignin a little bit or turn it down, because these trees are not going to live for 100 years. These trees are going to live for 2 or 3 years. And the thought would be that we could have an environmental positive effect, less chemical, less energy, less pollution, because we're not having to get rid of the lignin, and we were looking to see, do they actually grow normally? Are they adapted? Are they pest resistant and so forth? So it looked like it was a win-win. Going to be good for industry, save them money, produce more product, and be better for the environment. And we were also suppressing a native gene. We weren't putting in a gene from jellyfish or somewhere else that tends to get people excited. But all those scientific details were completely lost on the vandals. And that, one of the awakening is that this goes so much deeper than the science. The science usually is misrepresented and is not understood and really doesn't matter to the people who have these great concerns. It's these deep values. So this is one of my favorite little cartoons. This is how I feel about the state of GMOs, that we have maybe this incredible scientific ferment going on, creating all these possibilities, knowing these genes, the ability to modify them. You'll see several examples tonight. But then there's also this social chaos going on about should we, shouldn't we, is it ethical, what are the impacts, who owns it, and all the things you'll hear a little bit about tonight. And we really don't have a clue yet how to connect them. This controversy has been going on really for 20 years and getting worse rather than better. I'm just hoping the next generation does a better job than our generation at sort of trying to bring some rationality to this. So this is really what I'm doing tonight. You might think I'm summing up here with this slide, but that's not true. Or a little bit of orientation. You've already had most of that. What's going on? What's the context? What is genetic engineering? I kind of think it's good to actually know what you're talking about, although a lot of people in this area, because of the deeper issues, don't feel that that's that important. And then the good, the bad, and the righteous. The good is what are things that I think are good. Some of you may think they're bad, but I'll tell you why. What are things that are bad, or at least unfortunate side effects that are happening that it would be really nice if we could work harder to avoid? And then the righteous. And Nick talked about Jonathan Haidt a little bit, The Righteous Mind. I don't know if Gary Barnes is here or not, but he assigned this for our book club, so very useful preparation for tonight's lecture. But what righteous means is people who feel so strongly and so confident that they cannot really listen to reason, or they generate or create their own reason to serve the elephant that Nick talked about. So, and I think we really have that problem here, and it's going to be hard to get beyond it if we don't. And of course, it's not just GMOs. You look at the state of our government right now, and you see a very similar thing. So very deep problems when we have our ideologies so strong that we feel so righteous about them. So before I go on, I just want to put this up. This is kind of a sense of scale. You know, some people out there, and this would be more the libertarian viewpoint, would say, well, let's just get the government out of the way and let's just let technology and the market take care of everything. The other one would say, you know, there's never enough government. Biotech can only open up a Pandora's box. Let's just go back to nature. All industrial scale farming is just wrong. I mean, everyone should only have local, small, adapted farms and all, you know, so on and so forth. And the truth is somewhere in the middle here. And that's where all scientists are, whether you're an ecologist or a geneticist or a soil scientist. It really depends. And you often hear it said by scientists, the Ecological Society of America has said this, you need a case-by-case consideration. So GMOs are neither good, they're bad. It's just a method, it's just a technology. It can be used for good or for bad, like all other technologies. But in my view, this is where the world is today. This is dominating the regulations, this is dominating the fear. And so I'm trying to inch us up toward that way. And so it may look to you like I'm a fervent pro-GMO guy, but not all GMOs make sense. The ones that get through our regulatory system, because it's very stringent, tend to make some sense. But really, it all depends. And there are definitely bad ideas we don't want to pursue as well. So that's where I am, and I'm hoping that that's where you guys are going to be after I'm done with you. So you're probably already bored to death. You should be. So I put this in here to kind of say, stick with me, even if you've had a couple of beers. We're going to talk about this really cool stuff here. Actually, we're not going to talk about this last one, although a really intelligent person sent me an email explaining how he thinks GMOs are destroying oxygen in the atmosphere, and I explained to him why that's extremely unlikely, sir. So anyway, but we're going to skip that one in the interest of time. So what is genetic engineering? This is not going to be a very harsh course. So traditional breeding, you're mainly crossing stuff. Sometimes you use radiation and mutagenesis. We're going to skip that for now. It's relatively minor. But you're crossing different species, different varieties, and they can often be radically different. They almost always grow in different parts of the world, if this is agriculture. And then you have natural recombination, which sort of mixes it all up. So even if you might want one particular gene, you're getting a whole mess. This is a representation of a chromosome. You might know we humans have 23 of them. Each one of them has thousands of genes on it. So there's a huge amount of diversity apart from what you might want that's developed as part of conventional breeding, and that's how it works. We sort through that. We sequence it these days to help us sort through it, but it's really kind of a gigantic jumble we try to pick out what we want from. In genetic engineering, you start with a chromosome, and then if you want a particular trait, you try to find a gene for it. A lot of science goes into understanding what genes affect what traits, how to regulate them so they give you not too much, not too little, but the Goldilocks level. So a lot of science goes into developing this, and then you put it in asexually. So you don't make a cross. You actually at some point have the DNA in a test tube. It's a chemical. You cut it, you sequence it, you might modify it so it works better where you're putting it. Usually where it comes from is different from where you're putting it. You need some tricks to make it work well, and you insert it. And so there it is. And then you have to also then go back into conventional breeding. This is not an alternative. This is just a way to generate directed variability in traits of interest. You still need to put it back in and go through all this stuff and grow it in the field in lots of different places and make sure it works well in harmony with the organism, in harmony with the environment where farmers are growing them. So this insertion here, if I drew it to scale, you wouldn't see it. So 3 genes in a soybean plant is about 1 foot between here and Seattle. So you would not even see it. So that's the scale of most of the genetic engineering we're seeing. It's very, very small. You've probably heard talk about synthetic biology, where you synthesize the DNA for a whole organism. It's hardly been done in bacteria. It's not happening for higher organisms like plants and animals in my lifetime. I think I won't live to regret that because of their complexity. So really, what we're doing is we're tinkering. We're not engineering. We're not creating like a new bridge or a new building like real engineers do. We add a few genes for a few traits, and the organism itself remains intact. It has its integrity. So that's a critical concept. So this is what it looks like. In some way, you usually put these things in vitro in a sterile culture where it's easier to work with, and you insert the DNA into these somatic tissues. These are little pieces. They're brown now because they're dying. Some of them are dying and some of them are living. But these are somatic tissues where you've applied DNA. You may have used a biological insertion agent, which is very, very common, or you may have shot it in with a little microgun. But anyway, these are plants that are developing now from cells that have been genetically modified by inserting DNA into them, or they've had the native genes modified through a similar process. And so now it's just horticulture, it's just propagation. You take cuttings, you put roots on them, you get seeds from them, whatever your propagation process is. I'm showing you some poplars, cottonwoods, because that's what I work with. And then eventually you've got to get them in the field to see that they actually grow straight and give you the trait you want, and the trait's stable and is useful to farmers, or shows you or teaches you something about science, etc. So these are 2 rows of cottonwood trees. They're in their second growing season. They're in Eastern Oregon. We're working with a company back there. One is genetically modified, one is not. It's hard to tell. They had a gene for insect resistance. There wasn't a lot of insect pressure that year. They looked basically about the same. So that's your lesson in genetic engineering. Could you pass out the exams, please? See if people pass. All right. Not too painful, I hope. So now I want to talk about what I consider the good of what's happened with genetic engineering. This IPA is pretty high quality. I recommend it if you like IPAs. So GMOs have been adopted at a rate that several people who know better than I have said is the most rapidly adopted innovation in the history of all of agriculture. Faster than hybrid corn, faster than the tractor. So in the countries where the government has allowed it to happen, it's happened really, really fast. In one case, in India, local peasants stole some of the genetically engineered cotton from some field trials that were being done by a seed company working with Monsanto. They just went in. There was a very, very bad insect damage year, and the only stuff green was these field trials. So the local farmers said, this looks good, and they just took it. And a whole black market developed around this stuff. It had never been authorized by the government. So then the government created a regulatory authority, and they said, no, this is not legal. You can't grow it anymore. And the farmers said, oh, yeah? They refused to stop. And so they said, okay, I guess it's okay. That's what happened in India, where the farmers got in front of the government. But in many, many countries, as you see, the farmers have never had the opportunity to grow it. When they have, it's been adopted in this incredibly fast rate. You can also see here that this is the developed countries versus industrial countries, so developing like China, like India. They have about the same amount area of usage now. So you sometimes hear this is just about agribusiness and just about mega farms. It is not true. Small farmers who grow relatively small parcels, the value of something like an insect-resistant trait that means they have to use less pesticide, and these are often pesticides that their children are applying on these small family plots of land, is also very, very valuable. It's not something just about agribusiness. The other thing to see here is that it's grown on a huge area. Even though, as you'll see, some countries grow it and some don't, when you add up the ones that do, it's a vast area. About 10%, I've seen estimates as high as 15% of the arable land, the plowed land around the world, has already been in genetically modified crops for about a decade. So it's not something that's new, novel, radical at the edge. It's happening in huge areas, and it works. Farmers keep growing it. So, when I ask students what they've heard about genetic modification, has it been negative, has it been positive? Usually about 3 to 1, students will say it's negative, it's bad, it's toxic, it's harming the environment. Actually, when you look at the scientific record, that's not true. So these are a couple of papers. This one was just published about a month ago. This was 2010, where a bunch of scientists, National Academy here, these are just some scientists from Cal Berkeley and UC Davis, good scientists, economists, and plant breeders, looked at the record, looked at the literature, and there have been some very, very major environmental benefits. The 2 of them are mainly reductions in the amount of pesticides used, particularly in genetically modified cotton, and to a lesser extent in corn. Cotton uses lots and lots of pesticides. Both of these crops are grown over huge areas, so reductions of 5 or 10% mean millions of pounds not put in the environment. So that's one benefit. The other benefit is that herbicide-tolerant crops, crops that are resistant to an herbicide like Roundup, actually have allowed farmers to adopt conservation tillage, meaning they don't till, they can control weeds with an herbicide and plant directly into the stubble. So tillage is bad for soil. It depletes soil carbon. It makes soils prone to erosion. It also costs a lot of energy, so more greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the other major way there's been an environmental benefit from these. There are also some negatives, and I'll come to that in a little bit. But these are big because the area is so large. These kinds of changes are very, very large. This paper here also talked about economic benefits. And in our Food for Thought lecture series that I think Nick mentioned, we've had a number of speakers who've addressed this. The most recent one spoke this year, Nicholas, and I can't really say his name. I think it's unpronounceable. Kalatsatanakis, something like that, an economist from the University of Missouri, have done estimates of the economic benefits. And they're hard to do because you're trying to figure out, on a global sense, what happens. You produce more, the price goes down, different buyers and growers react. So you need a very complicated model. So I'm sure this is not a very precise estimate, but this is what he came up with, about $70 billion to 2010. The other thing he estimated was who gets the benefits. Is it mainly Monsanto? That's kind of the conventional wisdom. Is it mainly farmers? Is it consumers? and his conclusion was that it was mainly consumers. And the reason is you produce more, supply goes up, price goes down. It's not something you can see in the supermarket. It's a macroeconomic phenomenon. And I know we have some economists here, so maybe we'll get some more about that in our Q&A session. So again, against conventional wisdom, very large benefits. Most of it appears to be to consumers rather than the seed companies like Monsanto. So you can get caught up in the mega crops. There's also a lot of smaller crops that have very exciting stories. We'll talk about a couple tonight. One of them is papaya. This is very interesting because this is a virus-resistant papaya that really the Hawaiian industry was threatened by being completely destroyed by the ring spot virus. And the scientist, formerly of Cornell, was playing around putting viral DNA into plants and stumbled on this thing called RNA interference, which later on won a Nobel Prize. He didn't figure out what he was doing. It took some other scientists to figure it out, and they got the Nobel Prize. Nonetheless, that was what he was doing. And it's analogous to immunization, where we put a little bit of a killed pathogen in us or a little bit of its DNA, and that gets our immune system ready. Well, that's the way this works, except with a different molecular mechanism, but it gets the natural plant immune system ready for this particular virus. So very exciting, and there may be a new generation of insect-resistant crops coming forward using this technology. That's kind of the buzz in the streets. We'll see what happens. And anyway, you can see in this image, this is an air photo here. These are the transgenic papayas with a little bit of viral DNA in them, having this RNA interference phenomenon. These are the wild-type papayas. I don't think we need a statistician to tell you the effect. Similar thing here, looking down rows. I think this is in Thailand before they banned it. So again, the wild type, the transgenic. So dramatic benefits. And here's another crop that would be of a great appeal in the developing world. If you've ever traveled, as I have, say in Indonesia, you know how important papaya is as a staple crop. And there's lots of virus problems. So the AID was working on this, getting this out. I think it's been put on hold because of the GMO controversy and all the stuff we've been talking about. Just can't keep my hands off this IPA. I'm sorry about that. The other major example in sort of the good that I want to talk about is biofortification. We all know about it. All our cereal is biofortified, right, with vitamins and all that stuff. Well, in lots of places, people can't afford to buy biofortified cereals. They can't afford to buy much of anything. They just grow their own food. And often the food they eat is very narrow. It's mostly cassava. It's mostly rice, which is very, very low in a lot of these nutrients. So the idea is simply to bolster the natural vitamin and nutrient levels in order to improve the health of the poor. And this is not some crazy idea. This is happening around the world. When you don't use GMO methods, it's already in place, as it says here. A enriched sweet potato is currently being grown by 500,000 families. So Harvest Plus is a nonprofit, mostly funding from the Gates Foundation, that's working on lots of different crops and lots of different nutrients to try to improve the health of the poor. So I want to focus a little bit on vitamin A, provitamin A, and we'll talk about that also when we talk about the righteous a little bit. So why do we do this? Why are we working on vitamin A? Turns out when you look at the world, this is a map of vitamin A deficiency, and pretty much everything that's not green has mild to serious. This is the industrial world here, including ourselves, where we have fortification. We can afford to buy fortified materials. We have a diverse diet. And pretty much all the developing world has mild to severe vitamin A deficiency. And the consequences are really serious. So you see them here. This is from the Harvest Plus. Vitamin A deficiency is estimated to affect approximately 1/3 of children under the age of 5 around the world. 1/3 of children. I can't believe it whenever I read that. It is estimated to claim the lives of 670,000 children under 5 annually. Approximately 1/4 to 500,000 children per year in developing countries become blind due to vitamin A deficiency. Night blindness due to vitamin A deficiency is very high among pregnant women in many developing countries. So this is a really, really big deal. If you can make any significant dent in this, you are doing good for a lot of people with serious, serious health problems. So that's the reason for the interest in vitamin A as one of the goals of biofortification. So you can do this when you have natural diversity in carotene production. Carotene is converted to vitamin A in the body, such as this high carotene corn that's now being released and used. Cauliflower, you've probably seen similar things to this in the market. So these are from conventional breeding. This is cassava. This is, again, the yellowish from the beta carotene. That's from genetic modification. So golden rice. How many people have heard of golden rice at all? That's wonderful. I think we got a solid 3/4 there. So this is Ingo Petrikis. He was a speaker at Oregon State here about 9 years ago. He's the first speaker when we had the Food for Thought lecture series. And he worked for many years trying to develop gene transfer methods. When he started out, you couldn't put genes into things like cereals. He figured out how to do it. As he was getting toward the end of his career, he's a Swiss scientist. He said, I want to do something good for the world. I want to leave an impact that's positive, that's not just helping the Monsantos of the world to do their genetic engineering. So he got together with a scientist in Germany, Peter Baer, a biochemist, and they had the idea of building a biochemical pathway into rice grains that was not there naturally. So that took 3 genes to make a little biochemical pathway. No one had ever done that before. That was considered at the edge. And they got it done. He got it accomplished, and that's the reason he got on the cover of Time magazine. At the same time, the reaction to GMOs in Europe was heating up. Time magazine Europe refused to put him on the cover because they figured it would create an uproar and decrease their readership. So he ended up being quite a bitter man. And when he talks, he's very bitter because he accomplished this miracle he set out to that could have this amazing benefit for the poor and the malnourished, but it's been impeded at every step of the way, and you'll hear more about that as we go forward. So biofortification is the other major area when people talk about can GM have humanitarian, can genetic modification have humanitarian benefits. In my view, there's no question that it can, and golden rice is kind of the leading example of that. So the bad, what's not so great about this whole area? And of course, there's a cadre of people who are very anti-GMO, and their list would be a lot longer than mine. And plus, I don't have time to go through it all. So maybe we could talk some of that later. So one of them is that I think the agricultural industry, I think all scientists who work in this would agree that while there's these environmental and economic benefits to herbicide-resistant crops, if you use it too much, if you don't have it as part of an integrated ecological management system, the weeds will respond and become resistant. And some people have the arrogance to say, oh no, Roundup's too good. It kills everything. They'll never do it to Roundup, which most scientists laughed at. Well, it's happened. And why did it happen? It's just like the story with antibiotics in humans and animals, just due to overuse. People wanting the benefits now. Farmers, this makes their management very much easier. One herbicide controls the weeds. They can spray it whenever they want. They don't have to worry about the crop being there. they use less fuel and so on and so forth. So they want to use it every year. And then the seed companies want to sell it every year because they make money. So it was overused. It was not used as part of an integrated management system. And so now farmers have these huge problems in many, many weed species trying to manage it. That means the environmental benefits I told you about earlier are less than what they were. So presumably they still exist because farmers are still doing this a lot, but it's decreased them. And that's unfortunate. I think we can do a better job with this. Insect-resistant crops, that's the other major kind of crop that's out there. It's a gene from a Bacillus thuringiensis, BT, you may know about. Organic farmers use it extensively. But the difference is they took the gene from the bacterium, modified it so it would work in a plant, and so the plant makes its own pesticide. So you don't spray it in the environment, it's in the plant, so you have to bite the plant to get a dose of it. Well, that's been used much more wisely. And the reason is that it's been regulated by the EPA rather than the USDA. And the EPA had strict rules for how much farmers could grow, what kinds they could grow, and so forth. So that's slowed resistance development tremendously. But it's still coming along. And so there's a war here. It's called evolution. Whenever you put out something that's highly resistant in a large area, eventually evolution will happen, and farmers have to manage that. In the case of herbicide resistance, it's not the GM crops that did it. There's hundreds of cases of herbicide-resistant weeds developing due to overuse of herbicides. It's really the ground state for agriculture. And like I said, it's very analogous to the problem with antibiotics. They're overprescribed. People want them because they want the quick answer now. So really what we need is a management system and a regulatory system that's smarter. And that means we need to have ecological management, integrated management, and we also need to have a flow of new genes and traits to keep this moving. That's what sustainability means in this case, not one thing forever, but a flow of things. And as you'll see, the regulatory system itself is probably the main impediment to this part because it's so hard to get things through because of the stringency of it. So let's talk about the regulatory system a little bit. To me, that's one of the bads. I think it's a mess from any perspective, anywhere you look, whether it be in the United States, Europe, or the global situation. So here, this is similar to what you saw with the rise of GM crops, but this shows the countries that are using and the countries that are not. And you see it's like a 50-50 kind of thing. And a lot of the countries that really could use it, like Africa, for vitamin A, are not using it because of the regulatory structure they've adopted from Europe, which makes it very, very hard to do it, and so on and so forth. So we have this mix of different regulatory regimes, very difficult to do trade in this kind of stuff between countries as a result. And so I think it's just very unfortunate. So you might have heard talk several months ago, before the government was just concerned about staying open at all. They actually were trying to do things. Remember that time? Where Obama was talking about trying to have some kind of a free trade agreement with Europe. I can't imagine how that could happen. This headline from the Huffington Post Green Edition is talking about, will the labeling in Europe go away when we have this free trade edition? I think that's very unlikely. Europeans feel so strongly about this. I think that probably is the major impediment to actually having some kind of free trade agreement because of the different regulatory systems in the two different places. You probably all heard about the flap with genetically modified wheat centered here in Oregon. And to me, that's this editorial here in the Oregonian was actually by a couple of organic people who were saying that we need stricter and stricter regulation so nothing ever gets out. I think actually the opposite is true. I think we need smarter regulation so things that are safe and reasonable can get out for research and development. But what happened here is a tiny bit of genetically modified wheat was found growing in one farm in Oregon. Luckily, it was not on lots of farms, or we would have had a real trade issue and a real economic impact to farmers. And no one knows how it got there. But wheat is an inbreeder. It doesn't spread genes very much. It's pretty easy to contain it. If this was another crop, such as alfalfa or corn that are outbreeders, the probability of some low level of contamination after research, despite all the efforts to avoid it, are very high. And like I said earlier, you can't really develop any GM crops without field research. So here, the situation is that we had a little bit of contamination. The genes in this case are actually intensively well studied. They were already in commerce. They were accepted to be safe. But because of the different regulatory and market systems around the world, that tiny bit of contamination almost cost us millions and millions of dollars. Almost took away the livelihoods of these farmers. It's just crazy. We need a whole different regulatory system, and the world needs to get together around it. So I think the core concern about genetically modified food from the average people, such as yourself, are you average people here? Probably not if you're in Corvallis. You're probably left of average. Is it safe? Is it safe, and how is it tested that we can be sure it's safe? And there was just a fantastic article. I know this is a little sciencey for most of you, but Laura DiFrancesco is an editor at the journal Nature Biotechnology, and she took what I consider to be a fresh, brief look at this whole issue of how we assess it and why there's still a concern. And I actually threw out those slides because it would have taken another 10 minutes, but I'd be happy to talk about how we do it and where the concerns come from in detail, perhaps in the Q&A session. But I think I have one quote from her, and this is it. Critics and proponents of GM organisms, and she didn't say this, but except for a few scientists who are kind of at the extreme, but she's talking about the mainstream here, agree that genetically modified foods have failed to produce any untoward health effects, and that the risk to human health from foods contaminated with pathogens is far greater than from GMOs. They don't really even compare. And she gives some of the numbers there, and they're dramatic. And some of the major folks who criticize GM and want it labeled and taken off the market, and those are particularly organic advocates, they produce some of the worst of this. So it's kind of a funny situation there. And she goes on to say, contrast that with none reported for transgenic foods in their decades-long history in the food supply. So that is a fair summary of what mainstream science would say. And I found this one website, which is very nice, which had actually this sort of summary. It has all the logos of these organizations. I've blown up the top section here, and here's 6 of them. The AAIS, the biggest organization of scientists in the world, based here in the US, American Medical Association, World Health Organization, UN associated, National Academy of Sciences, Royal Society of Medicine, UK, European Commission, and then we can go on. So when you look at mainstream science, it's really pretty clear. The stuff that's out there now, it doesn't mean we couldn't produce something that has a hazard, but the stuff that's out there now, there's no evidence that it's unsafe, that people believe. I also have to, just to sort of increase your sense of credibility, I want to tell you where I found this stuff from this website, and this is what it said at the bottom of the page. Our manifesto on meme wars is here. Let's not allow moronic groups like Greenpeace to dominate the meme world with lies on important issues. So I'm not endorsing that, but I think they're onto one thing right, is the meme. Just some sort of set of assumptions that societies develop about something being good or bad or beautiful or safe. And they're talking about fighting this meme war where people might assume, like a lot of my students do, that this is all bad. And they're fighting against that. And I think if you looked at their homepage, you would see they're even more, obviously, a credible source of science. On the About page, Axis Mundi, whatever that is, are a rave rock step ultra party described as a cross between a System of a Down and The Prodigy. Just add Brian Cox and you're about there. So obviously, I don't know what that means, but this was sitting on their website, and this stuff is good. The stuff in blue-green is good. The other stuff, well, pretty cool, I guess. So in this last section here, if I haven't stuck my neck out far enough, I want to stick it out further, see if it gets chopped off or not. The righteous. And again, in the Heidean sense, we're talking about people who feel so strongly that they can't see the opposite point of view, they can't compromise, they can't collaborate toward a solution. So the first one that comes to my mind is just the role that GM is mostly controlled because of the patents and the high regulatory costs, is mostly controlled and put out by large multinationals. And the poster boy for that, the poster child, or the whipping boy is Monsanto. So we'll use them. And they would make you think that they have the silver bullet that's going to feed the world. And anybody who knows anything about hunger and poverty knows that that's nonsense. So that's, I think, the major reason that people have reacted to a perceived sense of righteousness from the large corporations that just get out of the way, I've got the answer. And that's just not true. There's no one answer to these incredibly large problems. So on the other hand, when you look at their stuff and you look at what they do contribute towards sustainability. They ignore some big issues like the fact that most of their GM stuff goes to animal agriculture, which has huge climate impacts, but a lot of people like meat. That seems to be the reality so far. There's a lot of big stuff that they kind of quietly don't ignore, but there's a lot of good stuff that they do too. And I took a look this morning, and there was a brand new over the weekend announcement in their website that they've announced they've partnered with the Clinton Global Initiative to work on honeybee decline. You probably know the pollinators around the world are in serious problems, have serious trouble, and we don't really know the causes. We have some good theories. There's probably a role for pesticides, but it really needs a lot of good research. And so they're probably putting in a lot of money. One of the things that makes me think that this is real is the World Wildlife Fund is a partner. We had Jason Clay, a vice president, as a speaker here in Corvallis a few years ago, and they have a philosophy very different than groups like Greenpeace, where they partner with major corporations to get them to do the right thing. And so this tells me that this probably is the right thing that they're doing and not just greenwashing. So complicated, the righteousness thing when it comes to corporations. It's yin and yang. So probably the largest source of this righteousness sense is the left versus right spectrum. And this gets back, and Nick talked about the Haitian elephant that drives, and then the driver on top. So basically, the elephant is what you believe, your ideology, what you feel to be correct, your meme, according to that wonderful source of scholarly insight I mentioned earlier. And then the driver sits on top, and the driver is like a lawyer that comes up with reasons, tactics to justify what the elephant is doing, what your intuition is telling you. And I think there's a lot of intuition in the world that's saying that we want a more socialistic, even communistic kind of society. We want a less market capitalistic kind of society. And GMO's association with agribusiness, association with patents, is no question about it, the major reason, in my view, of all the angst. And I've had lots of talks here in Corvallis and discussions afterwards, and the Monsanto factor, big corporations getting all the profit, controlling the food supply, that comes up time and time again. And I think a lot of the science that's done is done by people with this strong angst, and it affects the science they do. It certainly affects how it's communicated. So that's another piece of righteousness that I think, in terms of getting at the science at least, of what's really happening in terms of safety and economic and environmental benefit really, really gets in the way. So another piece, and here I'm going to really get in trouble probably, is the issue of organic versus conventional or GMO agriculture. And so what this says is the bees fly, the wind blows, the water flows, and seeds germinate, protect organic agriculture. What they're talking about is the risk that genes will move from conventional farms that are, say, growing GMO crops onto organic farms and contaminate them and undermine their integrity. And that's a serious issue for organic farmers in an economic sense, because they're often selling into markets that demand an absolute absence of GMO content. And that's a real issue. But when you look at the way agriculture works, gene flow and gene movement, it's not anything that's new with GMOs. It is agriculture itself. Farmers on different sides of the road, the same farmer, often grow different varieties, and they will contaminate each other to some extent. And we have rules, seed certification rules, and so forth, in place to say, we're going to call it variety X as long as it's 99.9% variety X. We're going to call it good and clean as long as the presence of rodent feces in there is below X part per million. Contamination in agriculture is everywhere. And the question is, how do you coexist? How do you get along? And so the notion that genetic drift will somehow, a patented gene will move from one farm to another, and now Monsanto owns your stuff, and this is a very common myth, That is not true. That is only true if it drifts there, and then you take it and you use it commercially for benefit. And then Monsanto will sue you, and they've sued hundreds of farmers. And that gets people unhappy. But it's only when they intentionally use it or concentrate it for some reason. When it drifts onto it and they don't get any particular benefit, they don't care. But the reality is that it can hurt the farmers. And that's why a lot of organic farmers in the Willamette Valley and elsewhere are very concerned about it. And that's a legitimate claim. But the point is we need to find a way to get along. We need to find a way to coexist. Agriculture has done this for thousands of years. GMOs are just the newest twist. And that requires both sides to try to work together. And in Oregon, you might have seen, although this bill was passed in the legislature prohibiting local regulations, the governor's committed to try to find ways to help organic farmers coexist with non-organic farmers, to try to come up with solutions. And they're very complicated, but we're working on it, as long as both parties don't feel they're so righteous that they won't come to the table and work on it. And that's the main issue, in my view. Woo! So, the writer has many representations out in the world, and one of them is through popular media. So there's a bunch of films, some of them I guess are called documentaries, that show all the harms and hazards and horrible things about GMOs. The latest one that I know of is something called GMO OMG, and you can Google that and go on the web and watch their trailer, and you can see this little kid in this hazard suit going through GM corn because it's so hazardous. So this one I happened to come upon. I don't know if anybody of you know Michael Spector. He's a writer, a science writer for New Yorker magazine. Do people know what SMDH is? How many people know that before they read the slide? Good. I didn't know it either. SMDH, an acronym, I had to Google this, standing for Shaking My Damn Head. Usually typed on blogs or in text messages to express disappointment, sadness. I'm going to use this to text my friends about Beaver football games, I think, from time to time. I could have used it at a few different plays on Saturday night. But at any rate, so that's the title of this little blog post by Michael Spector, and you can go online and see this, and I just have a few pieces of it. So genetically engineered crops, which are, in his, that is the author's view, the author of the film, such barely concealed poisons that he actually dressed his children in full hazmat gear before letting them enter a field of genetically modified corn. And then he cites another writer, as Ferris Jobber pointed out in an extremely thoughtful review in Scientific American. Seifert, he's the producer's intellectual laziness is profound. Quote, instead of using his children like marionettes for ludicrous theatrics, Seifert could have, I don't know, done some actual research. And then he ends this by saying, by themselves, genetically engineered crops will not end hunger or improve health or bolster the economies of struggling countries, but they will certainly help. First, though, we have to adopt reality as our principal narrative. For people like Jeremy Seifert, that may be too much to ask. So in short, he just tore this thing to bits. And there's a lot of other ones that I've seen that could have very much the same treatment. But it's out there, this, I guess, for profit sense of righteousness and arrogance that allows people to not bother with science, choose the science and scientists you like, and paint a picture of utter horror. So I want to talk about labeling a little bit. I think there's two more on my list here of righteous things before you throw the tomatoes here. So there's a lot of talk about mandatory labeling. Is that the right thing? Is that a righteous thing to do? And I hope you like this little cartoon here. So, in Oregon, I think it was 2003, we had a ballot measure to label all genetically modified food that was produced or even came through here. It was quite radical, and it was defeated in a landslide. There's obviously a lot of spending from agribusiness. In California last year, there was another one, came close to passing. I think it was like 52-48, quite close. That would have had done a similar thing in California. In Washington State in November, this November coming up, there's a similar ballot measure to label. So this is a big deal, and a lot of these local county things would have been similar as well. This labeling measures passed in Maine and Connecticut, or at least they'll pass if a number of states go along with them. So a lot of people feel like they want labeling. So the problem is that when you look into the details of what these labeling initiatives say, they say publicly that it's about a right to know, but when you look at how strident the rules are, you see that it's really not about right to know. It's an attempt to make it so onerous or so damaging to your brand that you will not carry genetically modified food. And indeed, that's what's happened in Europe. And so occasionally, the people say their real agenda. So Joseph Mercola, very wealthy, has a gigantic natural foods industry company. They're very pro-labeling because they perceive that that will make people pay more for natural foods, for natural herbals. And then Vandana Shiva, perhaps you've heard of her, very, very anti-GMO, an Indian woman who basically says here, with labeling, no one will carry GMOs. That's vital. You have to get that passed. That's the way to get GMOs out of the marketplace. So that's the real agenda. And I don't think anybody that's pro-labeling, at least the labeling that you see out there now, it's possible to do labeling on what I would call a rational scientific manner to help us keep track of the foods that we might consider particularly risky, but that's not what all this stuff going on is about. So AAAS, again, the largest scientific organization in the world, has come out with this policy, and they're by no means activist about this. I think this is the only thing they've ever said about GMOs. But they basically said legally mandating such a label can only serve to mislead and falsely alarm consumers. If you have a strict labeling system, it will cost more, and that will be passed on to consumers. And the poor, of course, will disproportionately pay that price. As I said, if you have labels, they're a leverage for anti-GMO folks to boycott and keep it off the shelves. And that's what's happened in Europe. Not more choice, less choice. And then what's the ethics of doing it if, as I said, the mainstream scientific community says the process is not dangerous? Why label the process if it's not dangerous? Right now in the United States, if we produced a food that had higher vitamin content, through genetic engineering, the FDA would require we label it, but they wouldn't care that it was genetic engineering. They'd care that it has a vitamin level outside of the range. Likewise, if we had an allergen reduced, if we had wheat that was very, very low in gluten due to genetic engineering, that would need to be labeled now because it's functionally different, but not the method. So we actually have labeling laws that, in my view, make a lot of sense because they're based on function and biology rather than based on this process, which we know is not important to the safety of foods. So when this ballot measure went before us in Oregon, pretty much all the newspapers editorialized saying this thing is a bad idea. This seems to be starting to happen with the Washington ballot measure. This came out a few days ago, the Seattle Times, saying vote no. When you look into it, it just doesn't make sense. It's just an impediment, a burden for Washington agriculture. So last thing on righteousness, is it righteous? Is it right for us to protect the developing world from GMO crops? And there's a fantastic book by Robert Paarlberg with very nice forwards by Norm Borlaug. You may know won the Nobel Prize. He died a couple of years ago. He's considered the father of the first Green Revolution. And Jimmy Carter, who you probably know is a farmer and a humanitarian, talking about basically how Paarlberg has it right. So Paarlberg's a political scientist at Wellesley, and in this book he talks about how adopting the regulations from Europe and Africa have pretty much kept GM foods out of Africa. And these poor farmers who really could benefit from some of these crops, and I've told you about things like cassava already, and there's many others, are not having access. So that's what this is. That's what this issue is about. Is that the right thing to do? Is that not an act of righteousness? So I want to end by really talking about the GM, the golden rice situation in a sort of a case study scenario by looking at the Philippines. And so we already talked about golden rice and why it might be very valuable as a humanitarian product. Well, it turns out that it's also vitamin A deficiency is a big problem in the Philippines as well. So the International Rice Research Institute has been doing field trials in the Philippines to try to see if it works, if it's safe, if it grows normally, and so forth. And they're doing that because in the Philippines, vitamin A deficiency has huge impacts. So 1.7 million children, about 15% between the ages of 6 months and 5 years. A subclinical deficiency, such as night blindness, 1 out of 10 pregnant women. So huge kind of an issue. So it's certainly, to me, it makes sense to look into this option. It's not going to be the only way you deal with it. It's not a silver bullet, but it could be an important part of the solution. So amazingly to me, with a bunch of funding from NGOs wanting to do good, I guess, out of Europe, but apparently mostly from Sweden, a particular NGO, vandalism was organized in the Philippines. People were busted, they were paid, they were given information that made them think this rice was poison and was going to undermine their livelihood, and so on and so forth. And you'll see a video of the vandalism in a minute, and you can see sort of the hysteria going on. For the first time that I'm aware of, thousands of scientists all over the world then organized a petition condemning this vandalism as doing nothing to advance humanitarian causes or the causes of science, and should be roundly condemned, and basically was. So this is, if you've ever seen an Eco-Terrorism Act, you're about to see it. I hope this is not, are there any children in the room? No, I don't think there's any violence in here, but at least to me it's very disturbing. So if we can go ahead, Justin.
Ang inyo pong napapanood ay ang ginawang paglusob ng ilang grupo sa compound ng Department of Agriculture sa Pili, Camarines Sur. Tinututulan nila ang komersyalisasyon at pagsusulong ng ahensya sa paggamit ng genetically modified na bigas na tinatawag na golden rice.
Ayon sa DA, makatutulong ang golden rice para maibsan ang vitamin A deficiency ng mga bata. Pero nangangamba mga nagprotestang magsasaka, estudyante, consumer at mga taga-simbahan na imbis na makatulong sa kalusugan ng tao, baka magdulot pa raw ito ng masama.
Ayon naman sa DA, nasa experimental period pa lang ang golden rice, hindi pa rin ito aprobado para sa human consumption.
Inirerespeto naman daw nila ang paniniwala ng mga militante, pero sana raw idinaan na lang sa formal na usapan ang kanilang ipinaglalaban.
So who can give us the Philippine version of that? I don't think you need the Philippine version. I think it's pretty clear what's gone on. These people are angry. Someone has told them something that makes them think this food is toxic, is going to undermine their way of life. And you can find this kind of information freely on the internet. Completely different than the mainstream scientific information that I know about the possible benefits of this for treating this huge nutrition problem. So I just want to, rather than sort of put it in perspective, I want to let you see the response from the Erie people about what went on and how they look at it. So again, Justin, if you go ahead.
Today, we learned that one of the sites for golden rice research was vandalized. This site was located in Pili in Camarines Sur. We are very saddened and disappointed that this vandalism has taken place because it affects the work that we are doing on golden rice research. Golden rice is an important new rice variety that enables us to combat vitamin A deficiency. And vitamin A deficiency is a horrible affliction that affects many women, affects many children. And we are doing our part to combat this micronutrient deficiency. This research is being conducted in partnership with the Department of Agriculture and the Philippine Rice Research Institute. We are committed to continuing this research because it is the only way by which we can answer all of the questions about golden rice that all of us are interested in, not only as researchers, but as parents, as families, as women, and as children who are afflicted by the disease. We will continue this research. We are committed to finishing it for the good of all Filipinos, for the good of all mothers and children the world over.
So it's just, to me, I thought I would never, ever see this day where something like golden rice that could have these amazing, amazing benefits for such dreadful nutrient diseases would be vandalized. So obviously there's a very, very powerful sense of righteousness on the part of the people who are doing it because of the information that they have. Something needs to be done about that, so in my opinion, so at least we can know if this works or not. That's really all we need to do. Whether it'll work for those cultures, whether it'll be a big contributor to the problem, we don't know unless the research happens. So to end now, and I actually didn't have this slide in until I got an email this afternoon from my friend Ricardo, who's a referee with me, by the way, an OSU professor. I don't know if you're here, Ricardo. But there you go, thank you. He said, Steve, what about phosphorus? Aren't you going to talk about genetic engineering? We have peak phosphorus coming at us. What are we doing about it? And it's like, holy cow, I haven't thought of that in years. And yeah, we've actually have some genetic engineering solutions, things that have been done, but they've been abandoned because of the GMO stigma, or they weren't developed because of the cost of regulations are just too high. And so that made me put in this slide. This is not about phosphorus, but this is about a wonderful piece of journalism. Same journalist from the New York Times who wrote about golden rice. I showed you a few slides back in the vandalism, called A Race to Save the Orange by altering its DNA. And I don't read many news articles and cry, but this is one where I did. And the reason I have it up here is because there's a whole variety of products that we don't even develop because we can't imagine getting over this wall of opposition. So what Amy Harmon is talking about here is this disease called citrus greening that breeding has no solutions for. And so right now, in the citrus growing areas, particularly in Florida, there's just increasing use of pesticides to try to prevent the insect vector from spreading this bacterial disease around, which is continually killing groves and may put the industry out of existence. And so this grower, in this article that she's profiling here, Rick Kress, is thinking about investing in genetic engineering as his only solution, and actually has a very interesting lead product, a gene from spinach that we've been eating forever that presumably is completely safe, that might work. But the biggest consideration is, would anybody ever sell this? Would anybody make orange juice with it because it's GMO? And it's probably the quickest, safest, best solution we can think of from a science point of view. But that's where the stigma's brought us, and that's why I was crying at the end of it. So on a lighter note, this is really where we're at. We have this impasse that we need to figure out a way around. And if we don't figure it out in the United States, if we go the European way, I don't think anybody will figure it out. So I hope we do something smart. But I think the world is really looking at two big choices, two big perspectives, and they're figuring out which one they're going to adopt. Are we going to decide that genetic engineering is unethical, irreversible, done really for profit-seeking and nothing else, unpredictable in its impacts on safety and the environment, and the only choice is to stop it or regulate it out of existence, versus to study and regulate it well, much better than we're doing today, so it becomes an essential tool that will help people in dire need right now, and there's no better example than golden rice. And given climate change and population growth and all the stuff that we're staring at and we're scared about, at least I am, helping to manage this incredibly scary future. So I think you know where I stand. You make your own choice. Thank you.
I need to hand off this microphone in a bit. We're going to go to questions and answers now. And there will be Shelley and Megan in the audience with their microphones so we can hear your questions. Before we go to questions, I want to give a big thank you to Steve once again. And I want to give a big thank you to the Majestic, to American Dream for their pizza, to Ted and his crew at the Old World Deli and Oregon Trail for providing the food for tonight. And hopefully we'll be able to do this again in the near future. Next month it'll be back at the Old World Deli with Bill Robbins talking about Tom McCall's legacy and showing that famous documentary from 1962 called Pollution in Paradise, the same year that Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, was published, helping to set the stage for the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s. So now to your questions. Shelley and Megan will have microphones. Hold your hand up. We'll point to you so we can get one at a time. And please state your name and then your question for Steve. Thank you.
Steve, my name's James Rodell.
Where are you, James? Right over there. Thank you.
And You mentioned that there is a sincere and honest issue involved with canola in the Willamette Valley affecting existing organic seed growers and alfalfa seed people, as well as the brassicas. Would you be willing to take some time and really give us more of an update about all the various parameters of that and what we need to be concerned about and so on and so forth?
The short answer is no. And the reason is that, that messy middle ground I talked about, well, coexistence with canola here in the Willamette Valley with organic seed that probably has a 0 tolerance, I would assume, is a tough deal. And I would imagine you need some kind of on-the-ground segregation. We've had that in Oregon before. I guess we have one sort of in place now a little bit, so some research can go forward. But we have people, Russ Caro's here somewhere, who are much better informed about really the agronomic and economic details of that. But I consider that a place where, the solutions are going to be hard. And it's also possible that they just can't coexist in this particular place. And that's a reasonable outcome that may occur. But that needs to be worked out, and it's not going to be based on crazy fears and bad science. It's going to be based on people getting together, seeing each other's differences, and trying to work out a solution if they can. And I think that's the kind of thing Kitzhaber has in mind when he talks about things like much more sophisticated identity systems for where growers are growing what. And I think that has to happen. But that's all I really can say.
Hi, Phil Burkham. So I guess the last question made me wonder, what are your views about how you can control the genetic spread of something? So you say maybe you can control it in some way, but it just seems to me that my personal fear is that reproduction is one of the most powerful forces in the universe, and maybe 1 or 2 is too high a number, escapement, if you're truly trying to control it. So could you speak to how if one camp is kind of worried about the control aspect of it, where the other is saying, well, I want to do the experiment and I'm pretty sure we can control it. I mean, how do you make a middle ground that's acceptable between those camps?
Yeah, I think for mainstream agriculture, at least as with current technology, you're not going to have complete control. It's also, a bit ironic that when companies started doing research into control methods, and I work in control methods, so I'm fairly deeply aware of it, there was this giant pushback that it was really a way to, force farmers to always buy seeds and further imprison the poor and so forth. And so all the companies, as far as I know, stopped that research on control. And I agree with you, it's going to be hard to make something perfect, but there are cases where it'd be nice to have some really good control systems in there, even if they're only 99.999% perfect, which some of them already are. On the other hand, so that doesn't mean that you're going to have to control everything. When you look at mainstream agriculture now, it's basically a minimal control system. And yet we have all kinds of innovations. We have coexistence of industrial canola with food canola, and we work those out. And there is spread in the environment, but they're limited in different areas. And like the gentleman was talking about, you need these coexistence strategies. So for those kinds of things, I think you're going to have those sorts of systems developed. But for a lot of mainstream agriculture, and if we have genes that don't produce hazardous effects, if we produce a kind of wheat, for example, that's low gluten because we've knocked down the genes that make it, does that need to be contained like a toxin? Why can't that be grown normally, even though it's a GMO, under normal agricultural separation and coexistence? So a lot of stuff doesn't need control. On the other extreme would be things like biopharmaceutical crops. If we start making medicines in crops, and there's a lot of good reasons to do that, those are going to have to be grown in isolation with these sterility techniques and all the technologies we can to try to make it absolute zero or very close to it. And so I think you have that whole range to deal with. In some cases, it really should be no control, even though it's GMO. In other cases, you might have some geopolitical kinds of control. In other cases, you really need absolute segregation. So it's just a mixed bag. I don't know if that helps.
My name is Jim Nelson. I've looked at one of your studies on making popular trees resistant to Roundup, a study that was funded in part by Monsanto. And I don't eat popular trees, and that doesn't concern me.
Yep.
But the problem, as I see it, is that a lot of the foodstuffs that are made resistant to Roundup that find their way into our foods that we consume every day, those foodstuffs may be safe in the laboratory setting where they grow the crop, they test the crop, it's fine. But they don't always test it after it's been drenched in Roundup. And shouldn't we as consumers be allowed to know whether or not the crops that we are eating every day have been drenched in herbicides like Roundup?
So you mean, shouldn't there be labeling? Is that what you mean? Is
Yes.
that basically?
Yeah. Some of the studies I've read, they
Yeah.
grew they grew the GMO crops. They tested them with laboratory animals. They came out fine, but they forgot to spray the crops with Roundup because it was a kind of a laboratory controlled experiment. In the real world, these GMO crops that are Roundup resistant are sprayed with this herbicide that none of us would consume voluntarily. And the testing just really hasn't addressed the herbicides that is getting into our foods. And there was a controversial French study over a generation and 4 generations of laboratory rats. It was really a concerning health issue, and they were testing GMO crops that have been drenched in herbicides. So aren't there studies out there that raise issues about not the crop itself, but the fact that the crops in the real world are being sprayed with herbicides, and that's getting into the food stream. Golden rice isn't sprayed with herbicide.
Yeah, so, I can't speak to every little study that's been done, but whenever I've heard talks from USDA regulators, from anyone, field studies are essential. Yeah. And so if field studies weren't done, then something's wrong or someone's misportraying it. So for example, the EPA requires when you register an herbicide-tolerant crop that they look at the pesticide residues. When you registered the herbicide Roundup, right, you had to look at the residues that would get in food and decide if they were at a level that was at least 2 orders of magnitude, 100-fold below the level where no effect is observed in lab rats. That's basically the standard. And so that has to be done when you register an herbicide. Now when you take a genetically modified crop, and now it may get more herbicide on it, you need to do it again and make sure those residues are below that safe level. And you need to do it in the field where it's metabolized normally. So I don't know about the studies you're talking about. That wasn't done, but that would be very shocking to me if that truly had not been done and was not required by the regulators. And then on your second point about that French study, all I can say is that the European Food Safety Authority basically said it's of such low scientific quality, we will ignore it. It doesn't enter into any of our thinking about GMO safety. And I actually had a slide earlier in my 4X version of this that had one of the papers that rebutted that study for all the different reasons. So I just don't take it seriously. It was also by a person who's a known anti-GMO crusader. He actually blocked the media so they couldn't get access to it unless it was given to select media that agreed with him. So it was an example of egregious publishing as well as egregious science. So the scientific community that I'm aware of, the one I respect, has basically put it aside as not helpful.
My name's Nick Wong, and I have 2 quick questions. One of them is in regards to all this genetic modified things, like where do you draw the line? Like, can we do it to besides like, can we do it to animals so that they like are resistant to like certain different kinds of diseases? And my other question is like, with the whole RNAi modifications, which makes them resistant to viruses, this is really like speculative, but like, isn't it possible for like a large company like Monsanto or something to develop like a virus that could affect crops in an adverse way, however also develop a crop that would be resistant to it, and wouldn't they have a complete monopoly in that aspect?
You must be a sci-fi writer. I think you should go out there and make some real money. So, yes, that's possible to do that. It's possible to create a crop that's resistant to, say, an RNAi pesticide. That's what you mean? and and then spread it in the environment, and then you get to sell your crop. So that's theoretically possible. Some of the agents of genetic engineering are concerns for bioterrorism. If you take a gene from anthrax or something, the toxin, I don't know anything about anthrax, so I'm on thin ice here, and put it in an agent that you could spread around in the environment easily, or put it in a food crop, that could be a serious issue, right? That would create a food scare as well, and hysteria, and possibly undermine our sort of food system. So those are legitimate concerns. You can also make a cross with a wild tomato and introduce a toxin gene and put it into the food supply without genetic engineering. So that could be done. That has been done. So it's not just a GMO thing. But did I get all your? Was there a first part that I missed?
Where do you draw the line, with animals?
Yeah, animals. Yeah, when you look at some of those polls, and I showed you some of the stuff from Susan Priest earlier, and when you ask about animals, they always create lower levels of approval than plants. So it's kind of microbes are the most acceptable, plants the next, animals the least. You can also do things for animals that are good for them, make them, for example, mastitis resistant. That's been done. Make them mad cow disease resistant. So there's things you can do that are good for animals as well as good for using them as livestock and pets. So should that be allowed? One of the hot issues is genetically modified salmon, which now is only intended for growth in land pens, not to put out in the ocean. And they're highly sterile, and so I don't know if you know about this, but they're basically salmon that grow faster when you feed them. They're kind of like they're feedlot kind of salmon. And that's been in front of the FDA for 16 years, mainly because of the sort of the ethical unease and the notion that they may disrupt markets or upset constituents of politicians. So that's an example of that. That would be the first genetically modified animal, and it's been sitting there mainly because of the sort of social unease about it as reflected in the political process. So am I okay with it personally, particularly under the ways that they were going to use it, and knowing that conventional breeding of fish does the same thing, just slower. We have incredible breeds of fish for aquaculture that grow very, very fast as GM salmon in some cases. So to me, it's not materially different whether you do it through the old methods by selecting for natural mutants or whether you do it through these new methods. The question is it safe? Is it sustainable? Does it lower the cost of fish protein for people? Does it improve sustainability? One of the notions is to grow these salmon in pens close to cities so they're not shipped from Alaska or Norway or Chile, and they have a much lower greenhouse gas output. So it would depend on that. But me personally, I'm comfortable given I know enough about it and it works.
Hi, my name is Julia Rosen. I have a question. I saw on one of your last slides a bullet point about open source, and I was curious if you could speak a little bit about how you think open source GM would change growing food and also the landscape of public opinion.
Yeah, that is a fascinating thing. In the microbiology area, there's this whole DIY movement to sort of do biotech in your garage and put it out there, and there's a website encouraging you to make a glowing tree for Christmas, and the problem is the technology is not quite there to make it glow very well, so probably wouldn't be very popular. But the notion that if people did it, and they did what they wanted, and got to get the government out of the way, that there'd be a flourishing of innovation and good things. And generally I believe that, but I also believe that you could do bad things too that wouldn't be good. So I think there needs to be some layer of regulation, and I think we can do this pretty simply. I think we could, for example, make a line between putting things in that are toxins or come from allergenic sources and just say those, you better go through FDA first, versus when you're tinkering with the genes that are there, turning them up, turning them down, turning down a known allergen. Do we need to go through FDA first for that, or can that be open source? Can that be done without it? So, again, I think that's the hard work of getting together and designing smart regulations. So I like the idea. I would like to see, for example, plant breeders here in town at USDA at Oregon State producing varieties, whether they be a low lignin tree or a tree that makes some of its own enzymes to help it pulp itself here without having to go through Monsanto. That's what I would like to see. but that requires we have a much less onerous regulatory system and obviously a less hostile political climate. So maybe someday.
It has become common in the medical community for researchers, before they present their research or their opinions, to disclose the funder of the research. Could you tell us who supports your research?
Yeah, so roughly, if you look at the long haul over the years, probably about 90% comes from public sources, the USDA, Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, in that basic order. And then I'm going to guess about 10%, mostly from forest industry. Monsanto gave me money for a 5-year period when they were interested in trees. They were part of this consortium that Nick mentioned back when they thought that they were going to be really taking over the world, literally, and producing genetically modified coffee and sugarcane and forest trees. And they realized they really can't do that. There's too many technical and social obstacles, so they just dropped it. So my relationship with Monsanto ended, whatever it was, 10 or so years ago. But forest industries continue to give me some money. I still have this small cooperative, and it's a small part of the research in my lab. Probably, I don't know, probably more like 15% these days. Where's Corey? She probably knows. Something like that. So anyway, but that's about what it is. Yep.
Hi, Janelle Ives. Watching those videos from Indonesia, you could see a lot of emotion on one side, and then the scientist's response, while rationally interesting, was not very emotive or did not create much of a response. The scientific community has been particularly poor in messaging and communicating. Do you see any methods where scientists could partner with NGOs to maybe promote GMOs in a better way, or to get at least the communication system out there?
Yeah, I think people expect scientists to be mostly rational. They look to them for not so much moral leadership, but get the facts right. So I'm not sure we want scientists to be too cute and warm. As you see, I tried a little bit and I failed dismally. But certainly the corporations are very much, they have their public relations departments and advertising, and you go on Monsanto's website and everything's warm and fuzzy about sustainability and everything else. So it's hard for a big corporation to be warm and fuzzy and get away with it. I do think, personally, one of my little pet peeves is I think that the public sector scientists, not every scientist, but the community at universities and public sectors needs to be much more aggressive and getting out the science, the correct science. That doesn't mean you take a policy stand on it, but like I've talked about what the mainstream community says about the safety of food, that's not really debated. That's kind of clear. But Greenpeace is screaming that the food is killing us, and we're basically, except for writing a random op-ed, quiet. And very few land-grant universities around the country, with the exception of California, are actually seriously engaged in getting the information out. And I think it's because they're too poor, too many budget cutbacks, and they're too politically correct. They don't want to take the risk of angering their constituents. And I think it's a tragedy. Same things happen here at this university where we really can't afford, it's not a priority for us to do this. And I think the stakes are too high to put your head in the sand. But that's been a hard sell for us. Yeah, all right.
Other questions? Back here.
Hi, I'm Craig. In
go.
one of your earlier slides, you showed that there was a pretty big rift between people anti-GMO and pro. It looked like it was even more pro. If that's true, why would mandatory labeling be the end of GMOs? If I would think there's people like myself who would appreciate seeing the label, but still being okay with eating it, and actually liking some kind of resource like a website or something to see if I wanted to look into more of information on the food and that.
Yeah, I used to have, and maybe I still do, the same viewpoint that let's be transparent about it. Let's get it out there, and let's get the narrative that we're hiding something out by doing it. And it's one of these cases where the devil is in the details. How you do it, how stringent it is, what the tolerances are for contamination. So for example, if you have to label everything as GMO when it's 0.5 or 0.9% of any one of component of food is GMO, it must be labeled. It's very, very hard for in agriculture and the realities of it to keep things that clean without separate box cars, without inspectors testing everywhere. And then what are the consequences if you make a mistake? Our entire shipments turned back? That's actually happened and cost tens of millions of dollars, where some contaminants got into a ship going to Europe and it was turned back. So labeling in principle is fine, but the proposals that are out there are so stringent that they'd be costly and they'd be hard to enforce. And then from my point of view, if they're about the process, not about the product, did you use genetic modification? And that's what the labeling proposals we have are. It's scientifically misleading. I was not part of the AAAS group that did that position statement, but I do think it would be misleading and scare people and provide a leverage for the strongly anti-GMO and the very well-funded groups to then lobby supermarkets, lobby major retailers to keep it out. So if you labeled the product, for example, if there was more than 1% protein of a novel transgene, and that was one that maybe science had some question about, I think that would be reasonable. But that's not what's being talked about.
I would think that it could also, I would think that in the long run it could reduce stigma if people saw that how many products do have GMOs and that they're not causing harm. That we can see.
You know, I think the labeling issue keeps popping up. You know, it's kind of you can't really kill it, and so there is discussion. It's still kind of quiet among the big players that maybe we need to get ahead of this and label ourselves and be at the table and having a big part in determining how it's done so it's scientifically meaningful and not so stringent that it's going to be so costly and so risky that we can't do it. So maybe we'll get there, and maybe this year. But I think people are talking about it because there's just this public concern of just tell us. So maybe it's time we started getting involved in that rather than seeing it happen to us. So I'm kind of with you there.
We're getting on to about 8 o'clock, so maybe one more question and then we'll take some time for Steve to relax.
I have 2 questions. There's one back here too.
Hi, my name is Mark. I think you touched on, kind of glossed over some of the different methods of doing genetic modification. When you're able to parse out more detail about each one, you said sometimes a microgun. Do I understand correctly, one method is to use a virus to insert a gene into DNA molecule? And not being a scientific person, I wonder, doesn't that leave remnants of the virus? Aren't there some health effects that, even if minute, might be cumulative if you ate that food 3 times a day for 10, 20 years? That's where my concerns rise. Can't we emphasize safe injection of genetic material, de-emphasize those that are unsafe? If a virus insertion is unsafe, we could make that less prominent.
Yeah, so typically, like in plants, people generally don't use viruses to insert DNA. In animals, like in humans, they often do. But they're viruses that have been extensively engineered to be safe. They've taken out their pathogenic genes and so forth. In plants, the main gene insertion method is a bacterium, and it's a plant pathogen, something called agrobacterium that causes galls. And so we use that, but before we do, we splice out the genes that makes a plant cause galls. So it just transfers the DNA. And so as far as we can tell, there's no hazards left of sort of the pathogen. We're just using it as a mechanism because it's been well studied and because these pathogenic agents have been taken out. So that would be the short answer. And the details would depend on every case, but the ones that are in widespread use are these sort of enfeebled, disarmed kinds of vectors, they're called.
Okay, we have one more question, then we'll be done.
Mark Thompson. Related to that question, how about the micro shotgun approach, which is, I understand, how glyphosate resistance started in soybeans, right?
Yeah, that's right. The ones we have. The original ones. I'm not sure if the newer ones are still produced that way. But the
how much
original
has
ones.
that technology changed?
You know, it's called the gene gun, where what happens is you have this micro shrapnel, which is like 1 micrometer, basically gold or tungsten dust that DNA is precipitated onto. And then you use either an electric shock or an air pressure shock or an actual bullet with a stopping plate so you don't shoot a hole through the plant. And you accelerate it in, and that's what this particle gun does. And it's not the favored technique anymore because you have less control of the integrity of the gene, and it often go in several places in the genome and little DNA shrapnel. And so it's working against the tendency to make the technology more precise. The funny thing is that that's not regulated by USDA. The technique where we use the pathogen, Agrobacterium, because it's a plant pathogen, USDA, the lawyers have decided that that's a trigger. Not because it's hazardous, it's just a legal trigger. And so companies that want to avoid regulation, and the regulations are onerous, can use a particle gun to avoid it. So it's coming back into fashion just a little bit. But it's not a technique that I would promote. I have such a gun, and I haven't used it in 15 years.
I don't like the shrapnel
Yeah,
concerns.
I don't like that either. It's just, it's not very elegant, is it?
And I wish that GMO advocates would talk about the ecological consequences of the difference between the glyphosate resistance in soybeans and the BT trait in corn, which acts on a wild organism, which, if that escaped, could really cause a bad ecological effect. I heard rumor that once they were considering putting BT into squash. Stupid.
And sunflower, when you had the similar issue. And basically, so what's been done so far, I'm not convinced that it would cause an ecological disaster like you're talking about, but there's a plausible case for concern, no question about it. And so, so far, EPA has not allowed, for example, BT cotton to be grown anywhere that there are wild relatives it can cross-pollinate with. So, for example, they're not grown in Florida. I think they're not grown in Puerto Rico, is it, where there are some wild relatives there could possibly be a transfer of the BT trait. So right now, all the BT crops do not have wild relatives for that reason. And so you might say the regulations are extremely precautious and admirable. You could also say we really don't know there's going to be an impact, and we're never going to find out now. But either way, it's not happening right now.
Okay, thank you, Steve.